Matthew.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Leo, for inviting me to the Schenker Institute for this event. I feel like I've been here for years. You've been so welcoming. And Sherman, I very much appreciate your causal caution. My mother would be very proud to know. She brags to her friends and tells them that when I'm around, people are very careful with their causal inferences. I think that is, she feels that deeply. Of course, the situation regarding the Florida reforms is that feelings are very strong about these policies. They're likely to spark tribal warfare in the education debate at the polls specifically. I think that I will probably be the least exciting speaker here, to which I'm very much accustomed in my personal life. And in this debate over the Florida reforms, by way of disclaimer, the question usually focuses on, did these policies work? And the coin of that realm is, as always, test-based results. This is where I will focus with full acknowledgement of all the limitations of testing outcomes. Tests are one of those weird things where everybody says they're limited, they're partial, they don't mean that much, but everybody jumps all over it and draws the strongest conclusions when those results are published. But that is where I'll focus. And from that perspective, it's amazing to me how often arguments about the test-based effectiveness of the Florida education reforms simply ignore the evidence about the test-based effectiveness of the Florida reforms. I wrote a little policy brief that summarized the available evidence. This is in your packet. It's a real page-turner. It has everything: suspense, intrigue, erotica. And that evidence is basically what I would like to discuss today. But first, a few words about NAEP. Don't be nervous. I think that, as Sherman showed, there are two basic defensible conclusions regarding NAEP. Well, the first is that while there is variation, that 4th and 8th graders are generally scoring higher in math and reading today than their counterparts did in the late 1990s. I think it's also perfectly plausible to argue that schools in Florida are more effective in raising math and reading test scores than they were in the late 1990s. That's at least a plausible argument. That's important, all right? That's good news. What's not defensible, and I think rather presumptuous, actually, as Sherman mentioned, is to argue that any changes in policy that happen during your time in office or during somebody that you support's time in office are the sole or even primary cause of those improvements. And even worse, using that as evidence to say we should spread these policies to other states based on the promise that these states will see the same results. It's perfectly fine to use NAEP as a source of kind of clues, where has there been improvement, as a guide for future examination, but that's obviously not how things usually go in our debate. And some people, namely state commissioners of education and superintendents, should know better. In Florida, I think this point is especially salient because there is, by education policy standards, a fair amount of very good evidence in Florida about several of these reforms that are so contentious. These studies tend to follow students over time. Sometimes they'll use low-stakes tests in addition to the high-stakes state tests. They employ powerful, albeit imperfect, techniques that try to kind of isolate the impact of these reforms from the countless other factors that influence testing results. And you, of course, can compare these studies to the NAEP method, which is subtraction. I will focus on 4 policies. There are more in the policy brief. These are the ones that get a lot of attention, I think it's fair to say. They're also the ones that have the strongest research base. And when I'm finished, in addition to being exhilarated, I think that you will have some idea of where things stand as far as the evidence. I brainstormed exciting ways to go through this evidence, but I couldn't come up with any that didn't violate the fire code and wouldn't risk Leo having a heart attack. So the first policy that I want to discuss, which has been mentioned already, is this idea of giving every school a grade and then attaching consequences to those grades. So starting in the mid to late 1990s, Florida began giving these A to F grades to each school. These grades were based entirely on testing results for elementary and middle schools. And shortly thereafter, they started attaching rewards and consequences. Most controversially, F-rated schools that received these F grades, right, in multiple years, were basically opened up to losing students. Their students could transfer to other higher-rated schools or receive vouchers to attend a private school. The idea here, of course, is that you put these schools in jeopardy of losing students, and so that should incentivize effort and innovation. There are actually a few fairly strong analyses of this policy in Florida, most of them from quite some time ago, between 1999 and 2006, when the voucher program was struck down by the state Supreme Court because it was deemed unconstitutional. Now, the available evidence from these studies suggests that these grading systems, or the voucher threat, or perhaps the threat of stigma from receiving a low grade, had a moderate but educationally meaningful impact on testing results in low-graded schools. The idea here is you compare the schools that received an F and were thus under that threat to similar schools that received a higher grade and compare them. So there was an educationally meaningful, not huge, but educationally meaningful positive impact on that small set of schools that received F grades. There's also some limited evidence, and this is where we get into like more important, deeper questions, that improvement was associated with certain changes in actual practice and policy. Some of these, a lot of these, there was an association between improvement and kind of desirable behavioral changes, such as allocating more time to instruction or focusing on your lowest performing students. These are things that we might want schools to do. There was also, however, on the other hand, some evidence in a couple of other cases that there were some schools, of course, as would be expected, that engaged in gaming activities, such as allocating more focus on writing tests, which were perceived as easier to increase, or, of course, the infamous focusing on the kids that are just above the passing line, so as to boost one's proficiency rates. So generally, promising evidence on the test-based impact of this school grading system, with some very mixed results on the very, very important question of what was behind those results. Second, this whole school choice thing. This in Florida was basically, as was mentioned by my fellow distinguished panelists, the proliferation of charter schools and the establishment of several types of voucher and neo-voucher programs. The evaluations of Florida charter schools in general, there are a couple of older ones and a couple of newer ones. They generally show that Florida charter schools are no better in raising test scores than comparable regular public schools. There is some limited evidence that charter high schools are better in Florida than comparable regular public high schools, as well as some evidence that competition for students from vouchers and charters is associated with very small improvements in the test-based effectiveness of regular public schools in the area of competition. So this is a pretty mixed picture on the second component here. We have some possible competitive effects, but little test results from the charter schools. Third, and you just bear with me, is this idea of making it easier to become a teacher. And that is basically establishing a whole slew of alternative pathways and programs into the profession. The idea here, of course, is to make it easier for people who don't want to take the traditional route, make it easier for people who want to switch careers to become a teacher through alternative certification, bringing talent into the profession, so on and so forth. The evidence here, there's some pretty strong evidence here that as would be expected, and this is often the case, the test-based performance of alternatively certified teachers as a whole was really very comparable to that of traditionally certified teachers, though the effectiveness, test-based as always, effectiveness of teachers trained by different types of alternative programs and pathways varied widely. So not much in terms of test-based effects. On the other hand, this may have certainly helped fill the demand for new teachers, especially salient in Florida during this time, which had a class size reduction mandate, which is important insofar as even the smallest classes are unlikely to be useful without a teacher. So again, generally null results overall, but some possible upsides. And finally, there was, as mentioned, the idea of kind of ending social promotion, retaining third graders if they don't pass a reading test. This is, of course, very controversial. I would note that, with the students who were retained were actually not just held back, but were actually given additional supports after they were retained. You really still need to wait on this one. It's just, data are just becoming available for those cohorts that were retained, how they ended up in 12th grade. Some very preliminary evidence suggests that the retained third graders did better for a while after they were retained, but there is significant fade out, though the effect did persist through multiple years. But again, we haven't followed that many cohorts and haven't followed them very far, so we really need to wait for future work on this. Of course, retention is also very costly as a policy. So there you have it. I would just remind you that there are several older components of the Florida formula, such as changes in funding flexibility and increasing graduation requirements that have not yet been subject to this kind of empirical scrutiny, as well as new policies such as Common Core and new teacher evaluations that are too new and there's no evidence on them. So overall, I would say that while, with the caveat that many of these things haven't been tested by way of kind of general conclusions, we have generally positive test-based results for a few of these policies, null results in a couple of cases, the implication here is that we can't judge this package as a whole. It's not like marriage where you have to marry the whole person, the good and the bad. You don't have to judge, the Florida reform package en masse, as some of its advocates suggest we do. The second conclusion I would draw is there's really not much evidence of a negative test-based impact of these policies. So the implication here is that these reforms will not destroy your school's ability to raise test scores, which is important to the degree test scores are a proxy for meaningful outcomes. But of course, remember that these types of policies that focus so much on tests don't often have negative effects on test scores. Don't always have positive effects, but don't often have negative effects. And third, and following that, there are still many open questions as to the actual behavioral changes that were behind the results found here. That's particularly true in, say, the charter schools. Why were some effective, some were not, as well as the changes that schools made in response to pressure from the grades. All right, so, and all of this, by the way, is generally consistent with the evidence that you'll find in other places outside of Florida. So clearly this story is not, that I've told, as I warned you ahead of time, is not really as exciting as people who say, do these, take these 5 magic beans and do these 5 things and your test scores will go through the roof. Nor is it really as attention-grabbing as people say, do these things and your entire state will be destroyed. As I've said many times, when you're talking about policy research or test scores in general, you basically have 2 choices. The first is to be exciting and misleading, and the second is to be boring and accurate. And as my wife will tell you, I tend towards the latter. The unfortunate reality here is that, this kind of improvement occurs over decades and not years, and even policies that have meaningful effects may not show up in aggregate test scores immediately. And this is especially true with the Florida reforms, considering that these policies focus on, in many cases, on very small groups of students. And certainly the research does. And that is all I have, and thank you very much for listening.